never get bored of listening to that noise of bees. And you can learn a lot just by the noise that bees are making in relation to how they're feeling. So I almost see myself as a bit of a scrum master when I'm working with bees, right? Because one day I'll go to the hive, everything will be fine. I'll inspect them, put them back together, and then I come back the next week and I take the lid off the hive and they all want to kill me. And sometimes it feels a little bit like that when you're working in an agile team. But you can act, no one's going to die necessarily, but and it's trying to work out what's going on in that period of time. What did you potentially do to the colony? What did you make a mistake? Why are they like that? It could be the weather, not enough forage. The queen may not be producing enough pheromones. All these type of things. So, and they produce awesome stuff, right? So, I'm going to pass these things around because I want you to actually touch them and sort of smell them. So this is an empty comb. You can see some remnants of crystallized honey in that. This is a block of unrendered beeswax. So if anyone in the military, ex-military, so if you ever beeswax boots when you were in to make them shiny, that's what you sort of use. So that's not been rendered or anything. These little bits of beeswax that I can pass around. There you go. Okay, and at the end, there's some real honeycomb there. You can come up, take a taste. So I want you to pass those round as we go, so you get a bit of an understanding of how awesome they are. So this is me. That's Mick. I'm the head of transformation. I'm an avid beekeeper. No one really cares about any of this stuff. Some of the best people with badges are probably some of the worst people I've ever worked with. I spent 24 years in the military. 7 years of that I was in the UK Special Forces. So I've been in lots of different complex situations, I would say. And you have to make decisions and take action. And this is what this is about: is how do bees take decisions? What actions they put in place? How do they set themselves up? And this is actually all based in scientific research. I'm not just joining, things together to make a good presentation. So some key takeaways we're going to go through here. Sort of discover the decision-making process. Understand some principles about complex adaptive systems, because bees are a complex adaptive system. We're a complex adaptive system as a single human being. When you bring all those humans being together, that then becomes a complex adaptive system. Then you put it into an organization, that is another complex adaptive system. So it's very, very hard sometimes working in a complex adaptive system. And hopefully look at how taking things from other areas can really make you think differently about how working in an agile team. This is just a bit. So you have a queen, right? You can see the differences. Queen is much longer, right? Worker bees are much smaller. They do most of the work. They're like the development team, probably. Products manager, maybe. Drones are much bigger. Okay, huge eyes. They're the male bees, drone bees. They don't really do anything in the hive. The only thing that the drone bee does is it's got one job. Does anybody know what that job is? It's to mate with the queen, but not the queen that is in their own hive. They never mate with the queen in their own hive. Okay, they always fly up. I can't go into all of it because I could just turn this into a beekeeping presentation. But these are the different castes of bees in one hive, right? So I'm going to talk about swarming. Not this type of swarming, but I'm sure you've all come across this before, have you? Yeah, scaling without a religious methodology. It's a thing. And actually, if you've never looked at that, it's worth looking at, because a lot of what Dan and Catherine talk about in that is really, really relevant. I'm going to talk and base this around actually swarms. Okay, this is a swarm of bees I collected. The thing I liked about this is it was in the shape of a love heart. You can't, if I blew it out, it genuinely is. So why do they do this, and how do they make the decision to swarm? Why do half the bees leave a hive? Okay, so there's way back now. There's this guy, Douglas Hofstadter. He wrote this book, and it's stories, analogies, this type of thing. But he kept going back, or he was looking at How do the neurons in your brain connect? What does that mean for consciousness? All this type of stuff. And he compared that to the social organisation displayed in ants and bee colonies. Okay, so he made an assumption, and this is back in 1979, and things have moved on now. And it's almost, Thomas Seeley, this guy here, is probably the best bee scientist in the whole world, wrote that book, Honeybee Democracy. He explains it almost like a swarm of bees is like an exposed brain. All right? And each single bee is like a neuron firing in your brain. And it's going out and finding different bits of information. So this is actually based in science, right? So these guys here, at the bottom, they came up with, they did some work with primates and how people make choices, primates make choices. We are primates at the end of the day. So you have some sort of choice you have to make. You make that into some sensory information. You then have to represent that in some way. You make a decision, okay? So you transform the decision. You then produce some sort of evidence. You accumulate that. You then put it into action, and then you make a choice about what you're going to do, okay? Now, honeybees do this thing called a waggle dance. So this worker bee comes back. So this is the same thing they do for swarming, or if they're going out to forage for nectar and pollen. They come back to a hive. Can you see all the bees around them? What they're doing, that bee has come back and it starts to shake, and it's telling the rest of the bees, I've got something that I need to pass on to you. And what they do is they all crowd around the bee to get the, oh yeah, right. It's like the scrum master coming back and saying, we've got to do this, or the project manager turning up and saying, oh, no, I actually want this feature now. So they come in, and what they do is they do this waggle dance. And when they're waggling on the comb like that, that is telling them the distance they need to fly from the hive to either take and find a new nest when they're swarming, or where they're going to find forage, okay? And what they do it in this figure of 8. And depending on the angle that they do that on the comb, so that comb that's going around tells them when you leave the hive, you need to fly at this angle to the sun for this distance, and then you'll find the forage, okay? And it's all based on signals, and it's all based on communication, all right? So what Thomas Seeley did, he did some research on this, and he found actually that bees use the same concept and schema to actually find the swarms. So they send loads of them out, find possible nest sites, they come back, do a waggle dance, they make some sort of decision. They will then go out, and depending on the number of bees that go to whatever site, they'll take an action, and they will fly to a new nest. Okay? Okay, so what does that mean for Agile teams? Well, we do, in Agile teams, you're doing the same sort of thing, right? We've got some possible solutions. We take that information in, we start to gather it, share it, we make a decision. Now, what bees do when they make a decision is they use something called a quorum, which I'll explain in a minute. They don't do things by consensus. They don't have to get everybody's input to make a decision, which seems to be the way things are sort of going now. And you find yourself stuck because we've got to have everybody's input to make a decision. Yeah, but we're not going to get anything done. So bees don't work like that. They work on this principle of the quorum. And I think probably we could take some of that from an Agile perspective and look at doing that, and I'll explain what some of that is in a minute. We then take the action, and then we implement some sort of solution. So what does that actually look like from a Agile team? So you'll get some sort of, you find some sort of alternative. You could be doing something like brainstorming or planning or anything like that. So during a sprint planning or initial project, you find different possible solutions, features, stuff to work on. And the activities, there's millions of activities, but if you're brainstorming, start creating user stories, putting stuff in the backlog, doing a bit of refinement. All right, that's the first sort of stage we're going through, which is the same as what the bees are going through, which is the same as what they found when primates were making decisions. This then second stage, right, is where we're taking this sensory representation and we're turning it into sort of a decision. So we've done some sort of gathering, and then the team gathers around the information. We have a conversation about, what's the possible solution, what's the possible feature. Loads of ways of doing that: market research, customer feedback, feasibility studies, technical assessments. And we do those type of things and pass that type of information on in things like daily stand-ups, sprint reviews, backlog refinement, user feedback sessions, all the stuff, all the techniques that we all know and use. It then comes to this decision-making thing, and this is the bit, I think, where we're maybe not so good at, and we could learn certainly from the way bees do it. Once you've gathered up all that information, you establish what's called this quorum. So you measure it by say, we're going to make a decision on 60% of the team saying yes, they're happy with it. Not 100% of the team. Okay? So it's changing it slightly, not looking at a consensus bit, but how many, and you can set this up in whatever, you can set the threshold, whatever you want in your team. And we can do this stuff through prioritization, voting, dot voting, anything like that, estimation, if you basing it on risk. And then actually we go and we put it into practice. All right. So once the majority, once the quorum, whatever that threshold is decided, that's when we allocate tasks, set timelines, begin work based on Agile practices. And then the things we do there is, sprint execution. We giving people tasks, different continuous integration, doing retrospective to assess what's working, what's not working, how do we need to adapt. So this works in an Agile perspective. And that's all three of them on the same page there. So the way primates think about decisions is similar to the way the bees make decisions, which I think we could probably take and think about how we use that from an Agile perspective. So, like I said, this quorum-based system, all right, minimum number of members needed to make a decision. Not everybody, all of the time. It's valid if the quorum is met. So, how many people have been in the situation where, Karen's on leave, so we're going to have to wait for Karen to come back. So you wait for Karen to come back, and then it's, Steve's on leave. Oh, Steve's on leave now. Oh, nightmare. And you end up in this situation where decisions don't get met or people don't start to do things. If you set this up from the beginning, everyone is on the same page that it doesn't matter. We just need a quorum to make a decision, and that's just the way it is, okay? And it allows decisions to be met without full participation, okay? Where consensus, you're constantly trying to get agreement from everybody. Everyone's got to support the decision. The thing about it fosters inclusivity and strong commitment, but it can be much slower, all right? It can be much slower. So these are the key differences on these type of things. So, bringing this back to sort of a complex, we're all in a complex adaptive system like bees as well. So this is from the Scrum Guide. This is what it says. Right, a product owner orders the work for a complex problem into a product backlog. All right. So it's already talking about complexity if you're using Scrum, for instance. All right. And agility it can be very complex at times. So just a show of hands, who's sort of used Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework? Some people. Very interesting guy, Dave. But I'm not going to go through all this, but it's worth spending some time. I think one of the questions we don't ask ourselves enough is, how complex is this actually going to be? And as humans, we like to sort of say, oh, it's here because we've done this before, and sort of this worked. When you're in complex, a lot of it's complex, you're taking a completely different approach. It's exaptive. You're not really sure what's going to happen all of the time. And a lot of Agile practices fit in this space here between complicated and complex, which he calls the liminal sort of space between areas. Well worth looking into, and just go onto YouTube. He's got a brilliant video of explaining this in relation to a kid's birthday party. Right? It's funny. He's got a very, very dry sense of humour. So knowing that we're in this complex adaptive system, okay, and we're working on complex problems, and we want to take a different approach to how we do it. Well, what actually is a complex adaptive system? So it's a system where all individual components interact in non-linear ways. It's not A, B, C, D, E all the way, right? It's not waterfall method, all right? Complex adaptive systems, something could happen that you just completely didn't know about, which could make things change very, very, very quickly. So then this leads to sort of emergent behaviours, all right? Like I said about, I go to the hive, I take the lid off, the bees were lovely, they didn't want to kill me, and then you take the lid off and they are not happy, all right? And this is going on in teams all of the time. Because if you depending on how often you interact with teams, you might actually not know what's going on. So you come back to a team as a scrum master and, they all hate you for some bizarre reason because something's happened that you're not aware of, right? It's because we're in this complex adaptive system. We're never going to know everything. So understanding this and thinking, I'm sort of going to be okay working in an uncertain environment can really sort of help you get over, oh God, no, this has gone wrong again. We're all in a complex adaptive system. And things are going to adapt and evolve over a period of time. Right? And that's why Agile practices fit into complex adaptive systems. So there's some sort of components in relation to this. Things are non-linear. You're not going to necessarily go from A to B to C to D. All right? It doesn't work like that. Things are emergent. Things are going to come up that you never ever expected, and you have to be okay with understanding that's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of self-organisation, and you really need to let teams self-organise when they're working on complex problems or in a complex adaptive system. All right? I'm not saying it's like the Wild West, but you have to give them some, and we took someone, in fact, I think it was Dan this morning talked about Dan Pink. You've got to give them autonomy to actually do stuff, all right? If you don't do that, they feel micromanaged or hamstrung in what they're able to do, okay? It's got to be adaptive. You've got to be willing to accept change at a decent pace, all right? And the thing that I think bees definitely do constantly, when you saw that waggle dance, it's all about feedback loops. They're constantly giving feedback loops. So again, I'm just going to go back to Dave Snowden. He talks about this concept of human sensor networks, where you're continually gathering feedback. Right? Who does an annual survey in work? Anyone? You're probably going to put in the survey what annoyed you when you came in and you couldn't find a car parking space before you fill the survey in. And then it skews everything, all right? And this if you put in, it's hard to do, but once people are getting into it, like sort of micro-journaling almost it is. And if you can gather that information, it's very, very helpful. If you can do stuff like around organizational network analysis, that type of thing, it's very, very helpful to understand. But you have to do it continuously. Right? And this is where, doing making sure you carry out retrospectives, those type of things are really helpful because that's what you're doing. You're constantly evolving the feedback in the complex adaptive system. So, this guy is amazing. If you go online and look at any of his YouTubes, as soon as you click it, you'll be like, yeah, that guy's a bee scientist. Okay? He has literally dedicated his whole life to understanding the behavior of bees, right? But the really interesting thing about the end of that book, which I didn't even know until I started reading it, is he then takes the elements of everything he's learned over literally 50 years and then thinks about how does that impact teams and things I've done previously. What is it that bees are doing, or the way bees organise themselves, that are applicable to humans. And he comes up with sort of 5 main things at the back of that book. And again, all this is based on scientific research, right? This is all scientific research. I don't think any of this is going to be like a wow moment for anyone. But I think the thing is are we really good at doing these type of things is the question I would ask. Right? We all wish we could do these things, but sometimes they're hard. So he talks about compose the decision making of a group of individuals with some sort of shared interest. Okay, so if you're all working on the same problem, right? And he talks about like the mutual respect that you have to have in the team, right? There's nothing wrong with disagreement and criticism, but it's the mutual respect part of how we actually go about that. So I think, minimize the leader's influence on the group's thinking. So someone laughed then. It's difficult, isn't it? Because if someone has got in their title something to do with leadership, some people think they have to. That means they have to control and always be involved. So you take the concept of distributed leadership or backstage leadership or what you ever want to do. You don't want the sort of long-handled screwdriver approach from someone that's got nothing to do with the work, constantly telling the team you're not doing the work correctly. All right. Bees, the queen in the hive, you would think is she's laying 1,000 to 2,000 eggs a day for 5 years. They can, right? She's not in charge. The worker bees are in charge in a hive. They are the hive would collapse if the worker bees weren't allowed to go about doing what they're meant to do. And they do so many different jobs in the hives, not just collecting honey or pollen, water, all sorts of different stuff. So definitely try and minimize this sort of leadership, long-handled screwdriver approach. Obviously, seek diverse solutions to the problem. So we're trying to find these diverse ways of solving the problems that come into us. Aggregate the group's knowledge through debate. That's why it's called honeybee democracy. All right. So the more debate we can have, the more communication. I'm not going to say this happens all the time, but I'm pretty sure we've all been in situations where we set up a project with all the best Agile principles in place. We're going to have a daily stand-up every day, and then, you're 6 weeks in and someone says, I don't know, do we really need that daily stand-up now? And then all of a sudden, things just start dropping away, and the next minute, no one's talking to anyone. And it becomes very difficult. And again, you get back to this, oh yeah, we'll meet up once every 2 weeks. And then you meet up once every 2 weeks, and everyone's like, oh, that's not what I was expecting to sort of happen. What's going on here? Same principle with going back to the hive and not understanding what's happening. All right? So constant debate. And using this sort of quorum principle. So whatever you put that percentage at is up to you. But that's going to help with like accuracy and speed. I'm not saying you do that. It might not be applicable all the time, but it's definitely something to think about. I want to just... so what we talked about now is the decision-making in swarms, but bees do that for foraging as well. So does what's anyone know what this is called? It's a law. You can map it to lots of different things. Well, bees follow the same sort of principle. They will only, when they're foraging, they will only send out 80% of the bees to the forage. Okay? And they leave 20% of the worker bees to explore, to find the next forage. Okay? And I don't know if anyone has ever seen this guy. If you haven't, get that book. Does anyone know Rory Sutherland? Everyone ever heard of him? He is unbelievable. Has anyone heard of Nudge Stock? It's like a big conference where behavioural science. So he started off in fact, he's been at Ogilvy marketing agency his whole life. Honestly, the stuff he brings into marketing. So this is what I'm talking about, is looking just outside of what you genuinely think from I've got to go to this person because this person knows all about Agile. Look further afield. He is amazing. Once you start watching his YouTube videos, or if you read that book, it's brilliant. And in his book, he talks about this.
This wonderful waggle dance system where they go back and inform the other bees where there is nectar and pollen and in which direction and how far away it is. And much to the bafflement of people studying this, it varies, but about 20% of bees or bee journeys ignore the waggle dance. They just go off at random. And at first this drove bee scientists absolutely insane, because they said, well, you'd think over 20 million years of bee evolution, we would have had bee compliance officers who would have enforced higher levels of compliance with the waggle dance to bring our nectar collection target in line with our forecast for Q3, right? Okay, this kind of thing that they say. And then they modelled it as a complex system, down to your point. If you look at it as a complex system over time in an unstable environment, if every bee obeys the waggle dance, you get trapped in a local maximum and the hive starves to death. Because you become over-dependent on what you already know, and because you haven't traded off by investing in what you don't yet know.
So I think we can get trapped in that, where we know something works and we totally over-optimize to do the thing that works all the time. And we don't give enough people in the team necessarily the 20% bit to go and find out what's the outlier here, what are the things we're not seeing. Like you said, what will end up happening is you'll over-optimize, and actually the team will struggle once they've over-optimized, just like bees do. So there's some myths around this, if you look online, but Google used to supposedly have this 80%, 20% time. Has everyone ever heard of that? It's sort of been, people that work there saying, no, it's just 120%. But that's how it was put across. So like things like Gmail, for instance, was actually invented by somebody having 20% time outside of what they were doing on a day-to-day basis, right? Because it's something that they were just so into the work, couldn't get their heads up. But when they give people extra time, where I work at the moment, they are actually trying to it's difficult, but they're trying to bring this in, where people get this time to actually think about other things. Think about Albert Einstein. Does anyone know what he did for a job? Yeah, he was a patent clerk, right? So you think, and he was spending his time, obviously, because he was interested in physics, all right? And if Albert Einstein wasn't spending his time thinking about physics, I don't know if the world would be a better place or not, but so you had to give him, and bees are doing this all the time. They're not over-optimizing, and I think we, in a lot of teams, do over-optimize because we think this is just working, so we're just going to do it the same way all the time. Now, I don't know, I'm going to give you some practical things to look at. Has anyone ever come across this? Yeah, so again, honestly, I'm lucky because I've actually done a little bit of work with Nigel and John, but that's nothing. I didn't. It was not related to beekeeping. It was helping them to do something on putting this into a different method. It's absolutely brilliant, honestly. If you're going to buy a book around this, Nigel used to work for Toyota. Not one of the 9,000 people online that said they work for Toyota and know the Toyota production system inside out. He worked in Japan, right? And they've based it around that. But they break it down into this complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and actually team science. How do you set teams up? The good thing is you've got Nigel, who used to work there, John's a professor, and Brian used to be a Top Gun pilot in the US Air Force, okay? And they've broken it down into these three areas. So complexity thinking. So I'm pretty sure there's things on here you have seen. So when you're in a complex environment, is look at doing these type of things. Okay. One really interesting aspect is who's heard of the OODA loop? Anyone? It doesn't get a great. The problem with the OODA loop in the UK is Dominic Cummings sort of spoke about it when he was trying to Brexit. He actually if you go back and look, he was using the OODA loop, right? Because it's based on you observe what's going on, you orientate, you decide, and then you act. And it's about getting in and around everyone else's OODA loop. Well, bees do that when they observe, they orientate to what they're doing, they decide, and they make an action. It's worth looking into that, the OODA loop. But there's some really good stuff around complexity thinking. The other part of it is all around distributed leadership. So again, it's all going back to the principles that's in that book. It's in how primates and bees make decisions and how we can use them from an agile perspective. It's broken down into these things. So some of this stuff is being talked about at the conference. I've seen it on, there was something on psychological safety this morning. Has anyone ever used Wardley maps? Simon Wardley? Again, these things are amazing, but so few people know about them. Just go out and try and find other ways of solving problems, really. And I like that one, this bias towards action. Not, we can't do anything now because it's the summer holidays. That's 2 months gone. And then actual team science. How do you actually set up teams properly to solve problems? So my biggest pet hate, I don't know about anybody else's, is when you get together and a new team gets together and somebody says, we're going to become a high-performing team. And it's like the first thing they say. And you're like, And the other thing that winds me up is, because I used to be in this environment, is, look at how the military and the special forces do it. Completely different context, right? Completely different context. I was in the same team when I was in that environment for 8 years, working together. I literally could tell you what someone was probably going to do in this situation. And what we all tend to do is form a team, and I think Dan spoke about it again this morning. You form the team, disband the team. But this team's going to be high performing, form the team. And you go through this constant churn. And people are not left in teams long enough to actually understand how everyone works. There's lots of different reasons for that. But this is a really, really good way to look at it. And I'm going to point you towards 2 podcasts. So does anyone know who Jim Rutt is? Jim Rutt was like one of the first people who was involved in the internet. He does an awesome podcast. And he was also... I'm not sure what position he was, but has anyone heard of the Santa Fe Institute? It's all based on complexity. He headed that up at one point. And the stuff he talks about on that podcast is absolutely brilliant. And the other podcast that's well worth... And I've actually... It's not because I've been on this podcast, but I have actually been on that podcast talking about bees. And it's called No Way Out. And the reason it's called No Way Out is because... Does anyone know who this guy is? That person's called John Boyd, and he invented the OODA loop. He spent years in the US. If you get a chance to read his autobiography, or his biography, it's really, really good. And it's called No Way Out because that's what he says. There is no way out. You're constantly going round in this situation of complexity, finding out what's the best thing to do. They have some awesome guests on there, not me. But they have some awesome people who know what they're talking about. So, summarise. Hopefully you discovered a little bit more about decision making, how self-organisation of bee colonies, how we can sort of inform what we're doing from an agile perspective. Better understanding of some of the sort of complex adaptive systems so we can drive some sort of innovation and get a better sense of agility with what we're doing. And just opened your mind to there are other... If you spend the time looking, all right, you will find other areas that you can bring into your agile practices. Not just completely made up stuff. It's all based. That book there is unreal. Lars Chichter, he's called. He's done so much research on bees. Has anyone seen on YouTube where they're pulling on strings, bumblebees? Look at that. So there's lots of thing within bee science now, but actually they're sort of conscious. When you think how many, we've got 100 trillion neurons firing in our brain, and a bee's got 30 billion. When you think the size of difference in what they can do is pretty amazing. So yeah, take a sort of fresh outlook. Now, take risks, right? Take risks in what you're doing. The reason I say take risks in what you're doing is because I'm allergic to bees. And I can prove I'm allergic to bees because I have to carry EpiPens, right? So if I can sort of take risks, and I do this in my spare time. So I had an anaphylactic shock a few years ago. Been stung loads of times previously. Got stung in my thumb. Something's not right here. Yeah, thankfully I didn't airway close, but I'm having immunotherapy now, so I'm not allergic to bee stings anymore. But take risks, because if you don't take risks, life gets extremely, extremely boring. And I'm going to finish on this. Please don't buy honey from Lidl. Please. 79p honey is not honey, right? 79p honey is sugar syrup. It's the equivalent of producing crap code and firing it into your system. Okay? People who develop don't want to produce rubbish stuff. Okay? And people who are on the receiving end don't want to receive rubbish stuff. But when it comes to honey, which is the third most adulterated food substance on the planet, we all go and look, that's cheap. That's the cheap stuff. It's not honey. I don't care who you buy it from, but please buy it from a local beekeeper, because you are actually and whoever tastes it in a minute, you'll hopefully taste the difference. So I'm going to sort of wrap up there. 40 minutes, so I don't know if anyone's got any questions that they want to sort of ask. Can be anything. Oh, sorry, yep.
How do they know, the bees, how do they know how far they've travelled in the angle of the sun?
Yeah, so when they move to a new area, so if I took say I go and collect a swarm of bees that's hanging from a tree, one of the things you have to do is you have to take that swarm at least 3 miles away from where you found them. Because what they do is they still think they're in this, because they could fly in that distance. You could take them to a new place that's a mile away, they'll come out and fly back to where you got them from. So you have to take them 3 miles away. And what they do is when you do that, they come out and they go, this is not a representation of where I was. And what they do is they come out and they do orientation flights. So when I was talking about the OODA loop, first thing they do is orientate. They come out and you can watch them. They'll come out and they'll start doing tiny circles. They fly back in, do a waggle dance. That gets then sent across the hive. And they start doing bigger and bigger circles until they find the forage. And then they'll come back and say, we're in a new place. They don't say that, obviously. This is where we need to go to get the forage. So that's how they do it. Go on.
Do you ever get multiple forums in one hive and telling people?
Yeah, you do. So when they're going out finding new swarm sites, they will go to multiple locations. And what they do is when they come back, it's quite interesting in that they show over a period of time that the first choice that bees come back and say, this is where you want to go, may not actually be where they go to. Because over a period of time, other bees will find other sites, and they literally, they will come back and they'll start doing waggle dance, and bees will knock them.
Right, so do they communicate between the forums?
They're communicating across the whole hive all the time. Yeah, exactly. Anyone else? Okay, there you go, feedback. And if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, there's my thing. And also, if you want to look at what we do, or what I do. So the reason it's called the 6 Bs is because my surname begins with B, Brian. And I know I don't look old enough, 5 children, ranging from 34 years old to 9-year-old twins. And because I have 5 kids, we are the 6 Bs. So that's where the name comes from. So if you ever, do things with teams, whatever, you want to come and do a beekeeping experience with a team or anything like that, get hold of me, and then you can talk about all this stuff actually as you're inspecting bees. So if you want to take the Instagram, then there you go. Cheers, everyone.